Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Greetings from Teen Asian Conference. We extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished guests for today's NADI lecture entitled Social and Economic Impacts of Climate Change in the Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna Basin. Asian Conference is a think tank institution headquartered in Shillong, Meghalaya, that works through research, training, advocacy, and exchange programs towards creating a better understanding of the East and South Asian region in the larger framework of the Indo Pacific. Our vision is for a stable, prosperous Asia where ecology is honored, diversity is celebrated, prosperity is shared, sovereignty is respected, and boundaries become connectors. NADI, which stands for Natural Allies in Development and Interdependence, is our ongoing initiative, which includes a series of lectures, conversations, and webinars on the common theme to highlight the narrative of a celebration of the common riverine and civilizational heritage of the nations and the people in the Ganga Brahmaputra Meghna Basin. For today's topic on social and economic impacts of climate change, our distinguished guest for this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, is Dr. Ritesh Kumar. Dr. Ritesh Kumar is the director of Wetlands International South Asia, a non government organization working for sustaining and restoring wetlands, their resources, and biodiversity in the South Asia region. Over the last 2 decades, Dr. Kumar has led integrated management planning for several wetlands in South Asia region and coordinated multidisciplinary projects on wetlands assessment, ecosystem services, evaluation, water management, sustainable livelihoods, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation. He has also been a part of several policy-making processes related to wetlands in India, with the key being a part of the drafting team of National Regulation of Wetlands, the National Biodiversity Targets, under the Convention of Biological Diversity and Indicators for Sustainable Development Goals. The potential impacts of climate change on the socio-economic change on flow and water quality in rivers worldwide is a key area of interest and of global concern. This is more for its negative rather than positives. The losses that mankind has had to suffer is therefore the consequence of this, which includes both sociologically as well as economically. Now, I would request Dr. Kumar to please take over the proceedings of this lecture, and we would now begin the lecture with a small presentation by him. Over to you, Dr. Kumar.
Thank you, Atri, and thank you, Asian Conference, for inviting me for delivering the lecture. I'm trying to share my screen. So just let me know if my screen is... Can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much again, Atri, and it's a great pleasure to be here. The topic of today is social and economic impacts of climate change in the context of rivers is incomplete unless or a holistic treatment of the subject is not possible unless we identify a river and wetlands continuum. I'll come to the details of it. But rivers flow and wetlands are where water slows down. The continuum between river and wetlands gives the landscape its integrity and security and different diverse functions, including climate change mitigation and adaptation. Thereby, I've slightly gone beyond the subject assigned to me to speak about this continuum, and at the end reflect collectively with you on how could we address this continuum when we design or when we act or prepare policies or programs around rivers, around wetlands, or around any development sector. Water is the bloodstream of biosphere, and water is expressed in rivers in flowing form and wetlands is where it stands or slows down. But both of these systems are expressions of water in the landscape, and the movement of water in its diverse forms provides the ecology and the development interface around which civilizations have existed since long. So let's take a dip into this. Now, before delving into the topic, I'd like to begin with the most fundamental relationship that we know of in water is the water cycle. And every school textbook gives us this unique perspective, unique diagram, which shows, water evaporating from a system and condensing into the clouds, and then coming down as rainfall, and then subsequently this cycle is what keeps the systems alive. Now, given the disparity of availability of water in the landscape, engineers have attempted to tame water through physical solutions, through like barrages, diversion weirs, and whatnot, to ensure that water is available for, especially for demands which are fixed. For example, irrigation. So, as our lifestyle has evolved, economic development has also meant changes in patterns of river and wetland usage, and thereby hydraulic engineering has has shaped the economic development discourse for quite some time. However, such discourses have also had their life, and increasingly, as science and more data is available, we know that such structures have also their long-term ecological and economic impacts. I would like to cite a case of Manipur in Loktak Lake. This is a floodplain wetland of Manipur River. The Manipur River flows along the wetland, and there are depressions to the right and left, uh, which form the largest wetland regime. The green color that you see in the map are basically agglomerations of about 70 to 80 odd species of plants on decaying soil, and thereby which float and give this wetland a very unique ecological character. Now, on the lowest end, the contiguous green mass that you see is Kabul Lamjau National Park, which is home to globally endangered ungulate Reucervus LD or the Sangai deer. This is one of the few natural habitats of deer that are left in this world. The wetland is the lifeline of Manipur state. But in 1970s, when economic development for the region was thought about by the planners, they saw the wetland as a huge water reservoir, and then planned to dam the wetland through construction of a barrage downstream, which is called the Ithai barrage, and then on the left construct a diversion structure which would take the water away to generate 105 megawatts of hydropower through an NHPC project. When the structure was done, an immediate impact was change in the fluctuating water levels, which in technical terms we call the hydrograph. Now, why the pulsing water levels or alternate drying and wetting of the wetland enables it to perform several functions, including one of the critical ones is allowing the vegetation to touch the ground and pick up nutrients and then float in the monsoon times. Also, the pulsing allows when the water levels decline, when water moves out the wetland, it creates a flushing effect and thereby keeps the water quality intact and allows flood buffering and whatnot, several other functions. But as the pulsing effect was dampened by creation of a barrage downstream, the vegetation could no longer flush. People had to move from agriculture to fisheries, and as a result, uh, there was a rampant use of vegetation for fishing, creating almost clogging the wetland. It has over the last 20 years, a massive effort has been there to ensure that the central sector of the wetland is open, but it has costed us huge amount of money, and the end is nowhere at sight. When we look at the problem from an economic sense, if you count the benefits and pit it against the costs that wetland degradation has brought about, every rupee of hydropower that has been generated has also meant 3 to 4 rupees worth of environmental damages, unfortunately, which have been transferred to the environment department to build in their budgets and ensure cleanup. So private benefits versus social cost equation is prudently seen here. On the right side, again, I'm while the talk is on, I'm conscious that on Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna Basin, but the subject is so vast. I would like to also show you some examples beyond GBM. In Mahanadi Delta, we had the famed Hirakud Reservoir, which is rightly called the largest earthen structure in the world. Stores post independence. This was famed, told by Jawaharlal Nehru as the temples of modern India. But these temples also became storehouses of large amount of silt. And when you look at the downstream portion of the delta, now delta system requires silt to evolve, develop, and maintain its function. New data that has emerged that locking up of silt in the delta, in the reservoir, and its subsequent deprivation downstream in the delta has meant that the delta has shrunk over a period of time, and this shrinkage then exposes the delta to several other effects of sea level rise and coastal erosion and whatnot. So any hydrological intervention in the landscape has come at an ecological, socio-economic cost, a cost which were not evident possibly at the time when these structures were developed. But now we have science and knowledge bases enough to track these changes. And also, rivers do not act in isolation. And to show you this, I give you a picture of Bullard Lake. Bullard Lake is a floodplain of Jhelum River in Kashmir. And when the Jhelum River, goes into be a downstream of Srinagar, it travels, and opens up into a huge wetland. The brown color shows its marshes, and then goes downstream into towards Pak occupied Kashmir. Now, when I went there in 2007 to conduct mapping of the wetland and preparing a management plan, I was aghast to see that the beautiful marshes that surrounded the open water area had all been converted into agricultural land, including plantations. So the cricket bats that we play with is made of willows. Now, willows can withstand water, and these willows had been planted inside the wetland on the claim that rapid growth of willows would ensure that wood availability to meet energy scarcity would be addressed, but it ended up clogging the wetland, silting up the wetland. So, as a result of which, over 100 years that we examined the wetland had shrunk by over half. The key function of this wetland is to buffer Srinagar and upstream settlements from flood risks. And as monsoons, monsoon and snowmelt that reaches the valley, uh, Bullard Lake is its primary buffer. But with the shrinkage in regimes, it was apparent that the buffering capacity is lost. So when we looked at the hydrograph downstream, the water levels, how they had behaved over 100 years, and again you can see different colors. The darkest color is an average of 20 years, 1920s till 40s, and then subsequently the pink color and the yellow color, and the final one, the dark blue, is the hydrograph towards end of the towards 21st century. Now, what you will see is that hydrograph in the initial years was very well distributed. This distribution is an expression of buffering function. That means with amount of flows, the flows are well distributed and there are limited number of peaks. But as wetlands degrade, as wetlands were converted, the peaks become more sharper and creating more floods. And towards the tail end, when you look at November and December, the volumes decrease drastically, creating situations of drought. So, despite sufficient rainfall, the landscape is no longer capable of storing water and buffering and acting as a sponge and making it available for various uses. And it was apparent in this case. So, what has gone wrong? What is so fundamentally, when you look at wetlands and rivers, we should water is a bloodstream of biosphere. Any economic activity or conservation is linked with the way water is understood and managed in the system. Wetlands are a creation of runoff, which the water engineers term it as blue water when rain falls and it generates a runoff. This is what flows through the rivers, and this is what is accumulated in wetlands. But then wetlands, there is another process that happens is transpiration, when the water moves into vapor state while it moves through plants, and then it becomes green water. Now, why I mentioned blue and green water is apparently it may seem that water that has not been economically used and thereby moves and is evaporated and considerably lost from what is available for economic development. But the process of evapotranspiration also ensures that the ecosystem is able to deliver its function. So, be it food supply. So, unless evapotranspiration happens through vegetation, no food production is possible. Or the ability of coastal wetlands to buffer storms, cyclones, all of this are related to the way vegetation behaves. So this is where the blue and green water are interrelated, and within this balance is what is the ability of the landscape to deliver its functions. Any attempt to focus only one component of the water cycle, be it the blue or a green one, is going to backfire. We will have to understand water in its entirety. And when we talk about water, we will also have to see that it is ecosystems, mostly the ecosystems wherein the blue green interface acts. So wherever water strikes ground, it will reach a wetland, and this blue-green interaction then gives you vital functions on which societies depend. Rivers are like arteries; they will connect different pieces, but wetlands are like the filters and different organs of the landscape, which allow the landscape to provide carbon sequestration, water supply, purification, flood protection, and different dimensions of ecosystem. So unless a dialogue on river also extends within its ambit a discourse around ecosystems, blue water, green water, and their management, their discourse is likely to be skewed or taking into account limited set of information. So how do we understand this connectivity? In a simple diagram, when you look at below, connectivity could be something. When we look at wetlands and its floodplain, you can see how a river, how a fish is able to migrate from the central river channel to its floodplain, and any attempt to reduce this connectivity, for example a flood protection embankment, is likely to impede productivity of both systems, like the river channel itself and floodplains. So it is an organic connection of the river with its floodplains that allows exchange of matter, exchange of energy, and exchange of biota. And what form? So we have to understand that water is a medium of exchange of so many things, and this connection, water then when it connects the landscape, be it a river, wetland, upstream, downstream, it allows so many critical ecosystem processes that have to be taken into account when we do any form of developmental planning. So, how do we see this connection? And let's take an example of Ganga Brahmaputra Basin, or most of the basin discourse I've seen centers around places that we live. But if you look at the rivers function because of their headwaters. The base flows, especially of the rivers, are sustained by the headwaters, wherein headwater wetlands absorb the glacial melt, and by absorbing this glacial melt within these ecosystems and releasing them gradually, they ensure that rivers flow, and then these headwater wetlands provide critical water resource function, including flood protection or low flow support. When you come down, these wetlands are able to then connect with the river and provide the production benefits, be it fisheries, agriculture, recreation. So connectivity is also about looking not just beyond the river and the floodplain. It is also about seeing the headstream. This is the point that has been sorely missed with most of the discourses. Most of the our movies and touristic places are hidden in these headwater wetlands, but they are often lost in major programming processes around wetlands. I this issue of connectivity posed a significant challenge to me once I was working down south around a river in Kerala, the Kallada River, and which was opening into an estuary, which is a beautiful place, Ashtamadi estuary. So I was looking into Sastankota Lake, a freshwater lake, which is still supplying water to Kollam, which is the places where we get most of our spices. And when we were examining the water levels, suddenly we were faced with a situation that since 2014, the wetland was drying up very rapidly. And you can see the graph on the left, wherein at times even 50% of the bed was exposed, which was unheard, unseen of in the last 20 years or so since the data was available. So we started examining what had gone wrong with the wetland, and it so appeared that there was heavy mining around the river for laterite. And when we talked to different stakeholders, they said yes, there is mining, but it doesn't appear to have any connection with the wetland and the river. But when we talk to people who deal with geophysics and substrate, the whole issue of connectivity became very apparent. The river and the wetland, the Sastamkota Lake, were apparently connected through a porous laterite bed. So when the river was higher, the subsurface flows took place towards the wetland, and when the wetland levels were higher, the subsurface flows flew towards the river, and thereby the lake, the Sastankota wetland, had two major sources. One was the subsurface flows, and the other was rainfall. Post mining, this connection was completely breached. This connection was lost, and thereby the wetland was exposed to only one form of inflows. That is, it became completely monsoon fed. And with decline in monsoon that was observed in the same time, the wetlands started declining. So, a wetland which had multiple sources of inflows started, becoming dependent on only one source, that was the monsoon, and thereby exposed to the vagaries of the monsoon. So connectivity then has to be seen in the form of continuity. You could examine it from the headwaters to the sea in a longitudinal sense. We could examine it from the lateral sense, that means the river and its floodplain, or even in the vertical sense, that means the surface water and groundwater. It's essentially the same water, especially the shallow aquifers, which when get super saturated, they will express themselves as groundwater levels. And when they come on the surface, they're called surface water. Now, the relationship between flows and ecology has had very excellent interpretations, but there is one example that I would like to share. I was working in an estuary in Orissa, Chilika. It is a Ramsar site, and the salinity there is a critical driver. The lagoon has salinity ranging from almost freshwater conditions below 5 parts per thousand to almost marine conditions, so moving up to like 20, 25, or even 30 parts per thousand. What you have here is a relationship between flows, which is shown in black bars, the amount of freshwater flows that is received in the estuary, and salinity. And you can see that as the volume of water coming into the estuary increases, especially the fresh water, salinity takes a dip. And this appears very rational. But when you look at the implications for ecology, each of these dips is a cue to different kinds of fish to migrate either from the estuary to the sea or estuary to the river and back and forth. So the continuum, thereby the point I'm trying to make, that the continuum or the flow conditions are the are structuring the biophysical response. In this case, I picked up one illustrative example of how fish migration is structured by salinity gradient changes, and subsequently this is what gives a relationship to the fishers who depend on the estuary for catching fish. And this is one example, but this is clearly applicable to most of the estuaries or coastal wetlands in Ganga Brahmaputra basin. So how have we? So the question then is, if the biophysical or the physical science base was so clear, why haven't we accommodated in the way we manage our rivers and wetlands? To answer this question, we will have to look back into the way governance has been structured around wetlands. Wetland conservation, although it appears very ecologically complete, it started with a concern for decline in migratory water birds. So English sportsmen and in North America, uh, suddenly the hunters, the game hunters, realized that the water birds, the ducks and geese that they were shooting in the wetlands, the populations had been declining. And when they started examining the reason why these were declining, they found that it is about the habitat. They depended on wetlands, and wetlands were critically disturbed, and as well hunting was there. Thereby, this whole idea of working on habitats started taking shape in the 60s. A group of ardent game hunters and conservationists came together and established the modern intergovernmental treaty around wetlands, which is called the Ramsar Convention. But when this, in 1971, but when you look at parallel approaches in India, it was largely around 1971, we got our Wildlife Protection Act. And one of the major approaches then for wetlands conservation was to lock up these areas as protected areas. So declare, designate areas where having large waterbird congregations such as Bharatpur or Vedanthangal and whatnot, and designate them as protected areas, and then limit human interference. Over a period of time, when I look at wetlands narrative, it has shifted quite a bit. In the 80s and the 90s, majority of this focus was expressed around waterbirds again. So when Siberian cranes stopped coming to Keladev Ghana National Park in 90s, in 1991 95, last pair being sighted in 95, that made the headlines. If you look at why wetlands are into headlines, are completely different reasons. The migratory birds are definitely, people do spot a rare water bird, or if they spot a decline in number of water bird, that does make headlines. But more importantly, today, wetland loss because of its functions is making headlines. For example, if I look at newspaper cuttings around Chennai, it was more about the loss of wetlands leading to floods, or in the Millennium City of Gurgaon, if it gets flooded, people are attributing wetlands to their functions and critical functions around water security. So what happened? What has changed ever since? So when we looked at wetlands, wetlands were governed through a rich tapestry of arrangements. Keladev National Park, for example, it was a game reserve of rulers of Bharatpur, and it was managed so in 80s. It was declared as a protected area. Vedanthangal irrigation tank in Tamil Nadu, It was conserved as a hereditary. People realized that the large congregation of water birds here make the water very nutrient rich, and thereby agriculture, the cost of fertilizers is drastically cut, and thereby communities requested the erstwhile rulers to declare and designate this as a protected area. The temple tanks of South India have their own rich history of water cascading systems in the Deccan landscape, and in several estuaries, including in Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna Basin. I have seen some very complex but very nuanced community managed arrangements for managing fisheries, wherein the fishermen, based on their knowledge of selection of the reproductive behavior of fish, the migratory behavior of fish, they were able to designate which areas to fish, which gears to use, which kind of traps to use, and which season to fish in, and demarcate those areas and enforce these arrangements. Around Beals of Assam and Manipur, you have similar tapestry of arrangements. But it was also apparent that in 1970s, when we started designating wetlands as protected areas, there was a limitation to this approach, and the most formidable evidence of it came from Loktak. Now again, we get back to the story of the deer. The deer was heavily poached in 60s, and it was almost declared extinct. But in 1970, when IUCN conducted an aerial survey and declared that no, the animal is still alive and certain individuals do exist in the park, and thereby poaching needs to be curtailed, the park was declared as a national sanctuary. And there was a degree locally that there was social consciousness around this animal, and the population has since increased. But again, this wetland was subject to hydrological regime modifications for hydropower. And when you look at the dark patches, now this is an animal which weighs about 60 to 70 odd kilograms and needs vegetation of up to 1.5 meters thick to be able to stabilize, walk, and conduct its life. With altered hydrological regimes, the vegetation mass could no longer touch the substrate for prolonged periods in a year, and then they started degrading. So, on one hand, due to protected area enforcement, the number of animals increased. Their habitat, which is this dark green area, which used to be about 40 square kilometer in the 80s, shrunk to 8 square kilometers because of inability of these regimes to address some of the core causes of habitat degradation, which is related to hydrology and the river wetland continuum. And in other places, people have tried to replicate habitats. For example, Bharatpur is the role model of most of the national parks. The same approach of creating mounds and clearing up large areas has been adopted in several wetlands. On the left is an image from Bharatpur. On the right is an image from one of the floodplain wetlands in Uttar Pradesh. On the left, while the birds have been, bird congregation has been largely maintained over the years. On the right, the birds they seemingly have reduced drastically in numbers because the natural habitat. This was largely not the way the habitat used to exist. This was a modified habitat, and birds were never accustomed to a modified habitat. Now, in 1985, when the Ministry of Environment Forest was constituted, India ratified the convention around 82. It was then wetlands started receiving attention, and a national program was built. The national program uh, has over a period of time become pretty rich. We now are one of the few countries with an atlas, a national wetland atlas, and including some very brilliant site-specific atlases. The ministry provides financial support to the state governments for implementation of management plans, and especially those plans call for converging, wetlands into developmental planning. Regular capacity development workshops are being conducted for wetland managers. Research grants are available, and a piece of regulation which specifically talks to wetlands is the Wetland Conservation and Management Rules, by which every state, including the states in Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna, have a dedicated state wetland authority, which are the nodal policy regulatory bodies. And once a wetland is regulated, notified under these rules, there are specific prohibitions, restrictions that are imposed and that are supposed to be enforced. And there are a range of international agreements that have India has done. India now has about 46 wetlands and designated as Ramsar sites. 8% of the known wetland regime in the country is already included in the list of wetlands, and by doing so, Government of India has committed to meeting the Ramsar Convention's commitment of wise use. In the Central Asian Flyway, which Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna is a part, Government of India has committed to conservation of migratory species and habitats, and we also have specific targets around wetlands in the national biodiversity targets for convention on biological diversity. What has also been a key learning, that piecemeal plans for acting on wetlands does not help, and we need to address basin scale drivers of adverse change, and a diagnostic approach is necessary for designing management plans, including specifying clear goal and purpose, wetland description, and so that a diagnostic approach allows for identifying specific problems a wetland faces and steering the projects around interventions around those plans. And within the national plan, at least, there is a call to use a diagnostic management plan for addressing basin scale drivers of change. I talked about wetland authorities. These authorities are critical institutions established, and they have four clear functions. They are supposed to be providing knowledge and advisory support in the form of inventory and management guidance. They're also supposed to regulate wetlands through notifying wetlands under the wetland rules, but also enforcing those rules and reporting on compliance, coordinate management plan implementation, and also create an enabling environment by promoting awareness generation and convergence with developmental planning. Different models of institutional arrangements have been attempted. One classic model of Chilika Development Authority is often cited. On the front end of it, this is an authority which is chaired by the Chief Minister, which has a working chairman as a Minister of Environment, has parliamentarians on its board, secretaries of key departments, and representatives of even fishermen cooperatives. So this is the front end, and on the back end, Chilka Development Authority has informal collaborations with over 50 odd institutions which support management of the wetlands. So several steps have been taken by the national government, including signing up to the Ramsar Convention, which now we have the largest network in South Asia, including the diversity of wetlands in Ganga Brahmaputra Basin that are included in this international network is possibly the highest. The right side photograph is Government of India signing to the Ramsar Agreement in 1971. But despite these efforts, wetlands have continued to degrade. We as Wetlands International South Asia have been tracking wetland loss, and we use a tool called a Wetland Trend Index. This index is constructed using data from over 300 wetlands. And what it tells us that since 1980, we have lost nearly 40% of our natural wetlands, which is the green line that is sloping downwards. But we have also been constructing new wetlands, which are human-made systems such as reservoirs, dams, barrages, irrigation canals. So natural wetlands in particular are on a declining trend. despite a rich tapestry of programs interventions that I discussed in the previous slides. So, what is going wrong? One is, when Britishers came and enforced a land use and land revenue system, they classified everything that had a productive value in terms of revenue into productive land, and rest was classified as wasteland. Unfortunately, wetlands ended up being classified in wasteland because these were seen as unproductive, filthy, malarial grounds, and these have become the modern waste dumping yards. If I look at Calcutta City, the Calcutta City's waste dump at Dhapa is in East Calcutta wetlands. Last week I was in Guwahati. Guwahati dumps its waste around Deepar Bay. If I look at Delhi, we dump our own waste around Balaswa Lake. And if I look at Chennai, uh, we uh, the city dumps its waste around Palikkattai marshland. So, despite a recognition of range of benefits that these ecosystems provide, cities have continued to treat wetlands as wastelands, and rightfully so. Wetland loss now is being seen as a development crisis, because people now recognize it is no longer just about migratory waterbirds, it is also about water, either excess of it in terms of floods or too less of it in droughts, and they are easily being connected to the loss of wetlands. Now, if you look at the national programs and then look at what kind of wetlands we have, what I show here is a breakup of our information on National Wetland Atlas, and I have broken it up into the biogeographic zones: Trans Himalayas, Himalayas, Gangetic Plains, Northeastern, semi-arid desert. So this is the national data, and in dark blue color are the natural wetlands and smaller wetlands. Now, what I've done is I've ranked these wetlands in terms of their area. So the number of wetlands below 5 hectare, 5 to 10 hectares, 10 to 50 hectares, 50 to 100 hectares. Surprisingly, and this is not so we are uh, we are a land of small wetlands. A majority of our wetlands, if you look, are the circles grow bigger as the sizes of the wetland get smaller. Now, when you look at the management prescriptions that we have developed thus far, including complicated, sophisticated systems of management planning, these do not operate, or these are not fit for purpose of managing small wetlands such as village ponds or our beels or uh, wetlands in the backyard. They need very simplistic solutions. We have created a rich science and governance system around wetlands, but when you're looking at the actual the numbers, the big banks, they're lying in small wetlands. So if you look at if I remember the figures from the National Wetlands Atlas right, we are aware that India has 7.7 lakh wetlands, of which 5.5 lakh wetlands are small wetlands. And these wetlands are actually where much of the action is required, wherein our tools are yet not very developed. The other important question to reflect is, urban wetlands. When I looked at the data, when my team looked at the data from 61 major, cities in India over 1970 till 1990, and what we reckoned that every 1 square kilometer increase in area had led to 25 hectares decline in wetlands. So urbanization is an important driver of wetland loss. Much of the urbanization may have been achieved by filling up wetlands. But it is not just filling up the wetlands, it is also about drastically altering the hydrology of wetlands. With the catchments so fragmented, with runoffs so altered by cement construction, concretization, that sewage has now become a new reality. Now, sewage is constantly being generated. There is no place to ensure that the sewage is safely doesn't find a place and it ends up in the wetlands. So it is not only wetlands are being lost due to urbanization, sewage is possibly polluting the wetlands in 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 severe proportions. But pollution is not just about sewage. When we look at new modern pollutants in our waters, we can look into antibiotic residues, amazingly high. We are looking at microplastics, which we are still reeling under. Now, much of our pollution sciences are or pollution instruments are not geared to address the modern pollutants, especially macroplastics or antibiotic residues, which are becoming far more prominent in Indian wetlands than they were before. There is also an issue around bridging communication. When you talk to wetlands, now wetlands uh, do not end up being attached with one sector. Sometimes it will be the Department of Fisheries, sometimes it would be the Department of Irrigation. uh, it could be anywhere, and sometimes even the Department of Environment, and we all use different kind of languages. To cite a case, there was this issue of diverting flows from the wetland. Now, civil engineers who were working with me on this problem, they gave me a logic that if you reduce the flow, you reduce the silt, and thereby wetlands is going to continue for a longer period of time. When I talked to the farming community, they had a completely different view. Farmers said that floods are critical because they built and they ensure high agriculture productivity by making floodplains very rich, and it is not the floods but embankments which create problems by creating waterlogging. And ecologists connect the both dots and say that look, flood pulses are also critical to maintaining ecosystem health. So one side you have this whole knowledge system which is backed by scientific measurement. On the other hand, you have community knowledge, which is largely anecdotal, but so very critical. And each of these could lead to divergent intervention pathways. The challenge now is for considering addressing river wetland continuum is not of science. It is about bridging science and bridging communication across different stakeholders. I'll also like to reflect on the power of citizen science. So, one part we learn through empirical science, which is costly or done by sophisticated agencies, laboratories. Citizen science is emerging as one of the most potent tools to connect people to nature. We run Wetlands International South Asia with Bombay Natural History Society, conducts Asian waterbird census, wherein every winter volunteers go out to their wetland and using a system of recording water birds. They record counts and deposit the data in our repositories, which is then used for different policy purposes. And in the last 10 years, without direct expenditure of a penny, the system now has records of over 1,400 wetlands. 170 waterbird species have been counted. 272 wetlands were found supporting more than 1% of their biogeographic population, which is that means they are, capable of being designated as Ramsar sites. The study also shows that 1 in 4 waterbird species have declining population in Central Asian flyway. So this shows the richness of capturing citizen science by training people and bringing them to wetlands, and in the process also educating them on conservation values. The eBird tool, which is another amazing tool wherein you could go to a wetland, record your water birds or even terrestrial birds for that matter, and upload your list, and then it creates water bird distribution data and species distribution data. So we need to not only harness the power of modern science, which is done in labs and through sophisticated equipments and experimentation, but also delve into the powers of citizen science. One of the most promising actions that I have seen in the recent times is when wetlands are integrated within development plans. When wetlands are not seen as merely conservation agendas or being done through departments of environment, but when they are built in local level development plans. These are examples from several of our projects wherein people are deciding on how their wetland should look like and what could be done, and by contributing community labor or even paid labor under Mahatma Gandhi Manrega programs, wage employment programs, they have been able to clean wetlands and ensure upkeep by, and also accessing the right under right technical supervision. Last year, Wetlands International South Asia and Monga Bay, we joined forces together to find out stories of hope in wetlands, and we were surprised to collect around 25 stories, and we could do only 25 stories last year. Stories where common citizens, just by their passion around wetlands, were able to work around wetlands, work for addressing challenges of pollution, desiltation, and create a positive impact around ecosystems. For those of you who are interested, if you could log on to Monga Bay and type Wetland Champion Series, all these stories are available. A bigger challenge now is, so if wetland restoration does need resources, where is this resource going to come from? In large systems, a single management plan will have components around catchment management, water management, ecology, habitat, and so on. So on. It becomes an investment plan of its own. Uh, and I picked up one of the restoration projects that I've closely watched, and you can see that funding remains a challenge, because wetland conservation initially, by putting so in 1985, the government of India did take a very forward-looking step in putting in place wetlands conservation program, but also over a period of time the whole idea of mainstreaming within states development planning was never followed, and thereby it created an inverted incentive structure. Wetland conservation, rather than becoming a part of states development and environment conservation agenda, became a project wherein central government assistance was needed, and thereby you can see for a Ramsar site, this is looked at, like you can see it's very aberrant. Sometimes you have loads of money, and certain years it is completely dry, and it is not possible to expect. So there are two challenges. One is in the form of governance, when the state mechanisms have tried to convey that wetland authorities and other systems can conserve wetlands, and they have tried to take charge. On the other hand, resources have been missing. It has created a very complex situation wherein people are disconnected from from the very resource on which civilizations have been built. So, how do we pursue this integration? How do we examine this connectivity? We have been watching this space for some time. Uh, Management plans are an important tool, but you cannot keep on writing management plans forever for all the wetlands. We will have to change perhaps the ways in which the story around continuum of wetlands and rivers is communicated. Uh, Now, I'm showing you a map of Ganga Basin here, but this map has wetlands. You have these dots, but it also shows you different elements of the landscape, including, at the top, there are glacial parts of the basin, and then there is a terai region, there is an alluvial region, there is a desert region. Now, when you start seeing the landscape in its functional form, wetlands around different parts of the landscape perform different functions. In the alluvial, for example, in Assam or Northeast, I would expect wetlands being production systems, for fisheries, for medicines, delivering, flood buffering systems. But the headwaters, for example, they would be performing regulatory functions. So from structural inventories, historically we have been studying wetlands to determine what kind of plant animal communities are there. So these define the structure of the wetland. We will now have to move to functional inventories, moving from what wetlands are to talking about what wetlands do to the river and vice versa. And this can create a new language around which different actors can come together. There is also a good deal of discussion around values. How do we consider values? Now, again, the dominant narrative around values is of instrumentality, wherein we consider wetlands as being source of incomes or source of things that we value for life, medicines. Now, what we should also relate that wetlands have immense cultural values. These are also important cultural icons. In headwaters in Sikkim, sacred lakes, nothing can be traded off for these wetlands. Any degradation of these wetlands is akin to degrading its culture. And these relationships perhaps uh, uh, provide a far stronger narrative for wetlands conservation today than merely saying that wetlands are important for livestock or wetlands are important for water and whatnot. The cultural and the relational value of wetlands can trigger some of the most nuanced connections that societies hold for rivers and wetlands. And finally, um, what does climate change do to all this logic? Now, if you look at climate change, wetlands are aquatic systems, and we expect much of the science that is available today tells that wetlands are dependent on inundation, and inundation is going to be variable. So, in Valley, for example, or in the alluvial region in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, uh, as the river is the river behavior is changing, so will the behavior of wetlands change. And importantly, also in chemical quality, as we are putting in more structures, riverine wetlands may see reduction in nitrogen and phosphorus, but isolated wetlands turn out to be net sinks. So when you look at climate vulnerability of wetlands, we have to look at two dimensions. One is that climate is not a new lens. It acts upon existing vulnerability. That means the existing risks to the system are going to be intensified. So, for example, in this case, when you look at this photograph, here is a highly vegetated wetland, and climate change might make the invasion more aggressive, and we are likely to see wetlands being, converting into a different form. For example, this might become a highly vegetated wetland and invaded wetlands due to climate change, acting on the coupling with anthropogenic cycles of nutrient enrichment, but it also can create new risks. For example, hydrographs, if they change, and we have seen this in several headwater wetlands in Ganga Brahmaputra basin, wherein being snow melt driven to wetlands are changing to rainfall driven, and rainfall driven wetlands have far more sharper peaks and sediment flux as compared with snow melt driven, and it changes the complete hydrology. It alters the complete hydrology of the wetland. What would it mean for wetland biota? And when I look at predictions for Ganga basin in particular, increase in water temperature and nutrient conditions may create favorable conditions for emergent macrophytes, so we can expect our wetlands to be more vegetated. Warming and prolonged drying may adversely impact on ectothermic species, so species such as crocodiles, which are where temperatures of the eggs, they control the sex of the species. They are likely to be adversely affected. Now, increased rainfall may be conducive for habitats of water birds, but at the same time, the breeding periods of Indian major calves are likely to be extended. So, different species, different biota are likely to be affected differently. But these are also, likely to create new scenarios for water. So, in one estuary that we are working, you can see how different RCP scenarios are completely altering the temperature patterns. And if you transform the temperature pattern to the inflow patterns, and in most of the situations, you will find that freshwater flows are likely to decline, and that means they will switch the coastal systems to a more saline system. So, how do we factor in climate change? And historically, much of ecological restoration, be it around rivers or wetlands that we have dealt with, they deal with stationarity based approaches. That means we look into the past and try to create pathways for the future. So, what did the wetland look like in 1970s, 1960s? And then we try to create actions that would try to restore the wetland as it was there in the past. Now, climate change is altering baselines. It also tells that it is no longer possible or feasible to achieve the past because the systems are completely different. Now, it is also the future is going to be uncertain. Now, for example, the rainfall patterns, if they're shifting, becoming more erratic, more intensive, that means the hydrology is so drastically altered that it is not possible to replicate or even dream of achieving the hydrology of a wetland that it was existing in 1960s or 70s. So what should we do? Two important messages. One is that we have to learn and we have to monitor. We have to keep on monitoring our rivers and wetlands, and we have to adapt our strategies accordingly. We have to embrace modeling to tell us what are the future scenarios, what are the risks, and then adequately take decisions and being very realistic about uncertainty. It is so important, so fundamental to realize that the sciences that we have used to derive our management of rivers and wetlands till date are going to be highly challenged in the face of climate change, and thereby monitoring perhaps acquires a far more central role in guiding adaptive management. So, in conclusion, wetlands river continuum is going to be very critical. Talking about the socio-economics of Ganga Brahmaputra basin, these ecosystems uh, are should not be seen merely as high conservation value assets, but also developmental assets, and their mainstreaming within developmental programming is critical. If we, it is no longer a situation wherein you can do development and talk about what is the impact of those development on rivers and wetlands. We should create a new narrative where we factor in the full range of the functions, the ecosystem service values of wetlands and rivers in the way we design our developmental planning, and create a polycentric governance mechanism. Polycentricity is a situation where power is distributed. In an era of uncertainty, in an era of rapid change, uh, all power centralized within state and then trying to achieve wetland or river conservation is not going to help. We have to ensure and create space for governance arrangements which recognize power at different levels. For example, there is a critical role that CSOs could play, there is a critical roles that panchayats can play, and definitely the mandated agencies such as state wetland authorities and the Union Ministry of Environment, the state departments have to play. It is a network of these governance arrangements that will be able to deliver conservation benefits. The third thing is to enhance science management interface. The kind of science that we do today, managers have to proactively get involved in setting the science questions and create a science which is useful for management. Science has two purposes. There is a purpose definitely of inquiry and discovery, but managers are grappling with challenges like sea level rise, changing species structure. Now, we need science which is targeted at the need of managers to be of use, science that can help adaptive management, and also critically also build a database on ecosystem services, the way these ecosystem functions, and they can be useful for the society at large. And finally, it is also about enhancing the policy environment, a national policy on wetlands. It is high time we have our own national policy articulating pathways for cross-sectoral management. Wetland conservation is no longer an environmental agenda anymore. It is an agenda, it's a society's agenda, and that by rivers and wetlands should be there should be an articulation of how these assets are seen by the society. How do different decision making processes consider these ecosystems within their plans, policies, and programs, and how does society intend to safeguard these ecosystems from anthropogenic stressors as well as in a changing climate. Thank you so much, Athri. And that was all that I had to present. Let me see if I can come back.
Thank you, sir. It was a very interesting discussion with wetlands and climate change. Like wetlands do are what do you call it? They are like they are the lifeline of any basin, river, GBM basin, any form of basin. But there are a few. There's one question that I would like to ask, sir. That every year there's a flooding in the basins, in near the basins, and because of climate change, the intensity and the frequency of these floods are growing each year, or you can say maybe every quarter. So how can climate change adaptation methods be implemented in that area, that in some way it could protect the people who are living there, and also try to reduce the intensity of the damages that have been caused?
So, two approaches. One is when you look at flood, or for that matter, any extreme event, there is definitely an increase in frequency and intensity of those events. But that is also calling into question our approaches of dealing with these events through physical infrastructure. For example, a reservoir which has been constructed with hydrograph, with water data, looking into the past, 100 years to use define an operating rule, can no longer serve for the future because hydrology is completely different. So where do we go? Where is the elasticity and where is the space? And landscapes have these buffers in wetlands, in forest, and in natural ecosystems. So if we are able to embed ecosystems as nature-based solutions into the way we work on extreme events, that would be good. But again, nature-based solutions take their own time to deliver. We need to be patient. We need to provide that space, and increasingly, it is found that a blend of gray and green is perhaps the most suited. Our experimentation in Southeast Asia and others have led us to the revelation that the existing hard infrastructure, when blended with soft ecology, ecosystems like forest and wetlands, when they are both treated as within the planning space, perhaps they have more lasting solution. But at the same time, so this is on the solution side, but we will also have to look into larger questions of how is our land use policy behaving, what is our land use control, why are river floodplains being encroached, what can be done to ensure that river floodplains are left for the river and they are not used to create new settlements. Most of the times, and if you examine the maps post flooding, in say in Kerala or all, these places used to be wetlands or river floodplains, and they have been occupied, and today we claim that there are flood disasters. If you build around the river course, you are definitely exposing yourself to the impact of hydrological regime. You cannot stand in the bathroom and claim that you have to be dry. So we will have to understand that there are more systemic solutions of ensuring that we enforce land use planning, understanding the ecology, and benefit from nature-based solutions, or blending gray and green solutions into having more sustainable, outlook towards floods and droughts.
Thank you, sir. So there's one more question, which says, can wetland management and conservation be achieved using community-led efforts? Um,
Absolutely, I am a firm believer in that. Wetland conservation needs to be unpacked from a very siloed and high average hour scientific approach, in which you see several sophisticated organizations being involved and thick reports and sciences being done. Yes, communities have managed wetlands since ages. Communities have been the guardians of wetlands, and in certain cases, choices that communities have made around wetlands have also been responsible for their degradation. But the biggest hope today, when I showed you the wetland distribution data, 5.5 lakh wetlands in this country, which is about 70% of wetlands, are small wetlands. You cannot imagine that there will be an authority and there will be a government person looking after these wetlands. Our biggest hope, and perhaps the only hope to securing these wetlands, is to invest into communities and community led solutions. The states or nation states have to create an enabling environment by supporting linkages between communities and rivers and wetlands. In the ministry, last year we were part of a program called Wetland Mitra. So you could sign up to a wetland, despite of any background that you have. If you are living around a wetland, you can walk up to your wetland authority and sign up being a wetland mitra. And as wetland mitra, then you will have an involuntary duty of watching the wetland, uh, taking care, participating in restoration activities, talking about the wetland, making others aware. I'll invite all of you to log into the National Wetlands portal of Government of India and read more about Wetland Mitra program.
Thank you. So, wetland mitra is something that like it can be means people who are living around, or for that matter, maybe people who are not living around the wetlands. Also, maybe it could be a way that people would know a little bit more about thing and help in conserving or rejuvenating the wetlands around. mm like small, being it small, being it big. It's important that we should try and rejuvenate that. But sir, one of the things is that because climate change is a problem that we've been facing for a very long time. Is there a way we can reduce the effects of thing, or maybe if there is a way that we can adapt towards, especially for the people living in the basin. For them, the climate change affects really heavily because they are the ones who lose their livelihood. They have to shift to another place because of increased frequency of disasters within the sea and all that, like cyclones. It also they have to shift to a further place, but it also disrupts their lives. So can climate change adaptation and wetland authority come up with a thing that could maybe not rehabilitate them that far away, but also try and protect their livelihoods by giving them employment or something like that?
There are so these are larger questions. So I don't think climate change is a problem. Climate change is a reality. Call it whatever. It is there. It is the elephant in the room. We need to recognize whether our science tells us or not, or experiment confirms or not. Climate change is there, and its impacts are evident. This November has been the wettest thus far. October has been the wettest thus far in 50s or 60 years. I never used to witness rains in Delhi in October, and come October, we had rains around, in 5 or 6 days even. So it is a new reality. So adaptation, definitely. So two ways. One is reducing impact of climate change. Wetlands can be of great help because several wetlands can sequester carbon much more effectively than other, even forests. High altitude peatlands, we don't have good data on high altitude peatlands, which can be very effective stores. If we are able to map those stores and preserve those stores, we can act on the mitigation front. On adaptation, yes, wetlands can provide critical buffers and support adaptation in multiple ways. And definitely your idea of protecting livelihoods can be built around developmental plans for the regions where wetland communities are based.
Okay, so there's another question. How can we bring private finance to wetlands to ensure their sustainability?
There are number of cases where private sector is proactively coming forth to support wetlands conservation. right from support to direct conservation action, restoration action, to more passive support such as support to monitoring or support to construction of watchtowers and infrastructure around wetlands. Now, private sector to come into wetlands, we will have to make them a partner. Yeah, right. So realize that private sector is also a part of the society, and under their corporate social responsibility and corporate environmental responsibility commitments, we can bring in wetlands. Most importantly, wherever you see major corporate areas, be it Gurugram or in Chennai, when you look at Chennai floods, the biggest impact was not around ecosystems, it was around corporates having to close their offices and production facilities for certain times, for which they incurred huge losses. Water risk today is perhaps one of the most fundamental risks for businesses. And unless businesses start becoming part of the solution, that means reducing their own footprint on water and proactively acting or partnering with governments and civil society on wetlands conservation, things are going to even get worse.
Yes, it is a thing. It's important that we maybe if we bring everybody together, then maybe managing the wetlands and conserving our thing will become a little easier rather than only depending on any one organization. If all of us come together to contribute in a small little ways to conserve these, it would also give us that thing that we have done something to save our environment,
Yeah.
and also to protect the river that has given us, like, if we are here today because rivers happened, the civilization, the history is because of the rivers. And now when it comes that it's our time to conserve the river, then we should do everything that we can. So, sir, other than that, one more thing is that the COP26 recently concluded with a number of recommendations for countries to follow. So, sir, how do you feel that can COP26 goals help in conserving the wetlands from the harmful effects of climate change? You said climate change is a reality. It's the elephant in the room. We cannot stop climate change. We need to adapt and make our lives, means we need to adapt towards the the reality that we are facing we are living in times where climate change is very prevalent. But how can the COP26 goals that had been discussed for the in the conference be able to help in conserving or to some yeah conserving or rejuvenating affair, the wetlands, and also kind of reducing the harmful and the negative effects of this phenomena?
So, Wetlands International was there at COP26, and to our encouragement, we now find more allies than ever on integrating or considering wetlands in climate change processes. Biggest hope that I see today is wetlands being integrated within nationally determined contribution. NDCs are an important pathways for achieving a 1.5 degree centigrade world. And if wetlands are integrated within NDCs, perhaps that is the biggest bang for the buck that we can get. Unfortunately, the discourse around wetlands and climate change has picked up a few wetlands, which is, for example, peatlands, which are carbon intensive. But whenever we destroy a wetland, we will need to replace those functions with built infrastructure, and that creates more carbon footprint. For example, destroy a river floodplain, you need to build an embankment. Build an embankment, you get more cement, more steel, more engineering, more carbon intensive economies. Now, those economies are not accounted for. Whenever we destroy a natural ecosystem and replace it with a physical infrastructure, we increase the footprint, the carbon footprint, and that increases our carbon intensity. So we will have to ensure that natural ecosystems restoration becomes an active part of climate change mitigation and adaptation pathway, also aligning with uh, the decade on ecological restoration targets that we are looking at.
And so, are there any legal frameworks that are present in India, especially which are like solely focused on managing the on managing the wetlands, not the basin, managing wetland, conserving them? Any form of legal framework that is kind of very strict, that says that there are certain ways that we are supposed to work towards conserving them? And are there any kind of legal frameworks that we see today in India, sir?
So in 2017, we had a piece of, a rule that was notified under the Environment Protection Act, which is called Wetlands Conservation and Management Rules, and that provides an excellent legal framework for conserving natural wetlands. But beyond this, provisions of Wildlife Protection Act, Indian Forest Act, Fisheries Act, there are a number of acts which are complementary to wetlands conservation. So there is no dearth of regulatory mechanism. What is definitely a challenge is the intent to implement those regulations and on the ground conserve wetlands. What I said, so on one side you have this tapestry of rules, on the other side you also have a very lax land record system, wherein wetlands can be put it as wastelands and then you can formally convert them. So the situation on the ground, none of the states have are yet to incorporate wetlands in their land record system. And unless that fundamental flaw is fixed, barring one state, Uttar Pradesh has done an Herculean effort of documenting nearly 1,15,000 wetlands in their land records. Several states are still dragging their feet in creating accounting for their asset, which is these wetlands, and this is where much of the damage is happening. So, what the point I'm trying to make, a regulatory framework is not a problem. It's the implementation, lacks implementation, penalization, wherein much of the action needs to happen now.
Thank you, sir. This lecture was a very informative topic. Means wetlands, climate change, the impacts on livelihoods and economics is. Um, we do know that it has a big effect, but knowing that climate change is not that like as it is not that it has got positives and all is also very, it's very encouraging to hear. So but as you said, that involve implementation and all needs to be there, and penalization and all needs to be there in order to make a little more firm kind of managing or conserving wetlands, or for that matter all our biodiversity, whether we are living in near the river, whether we are living near in the city. So thank you, sir. It was a very lovely lecture and a very informative and interactive lecture, sir. We just have one last question before we would wrap up, sir. How do we manage the challenge of increased urbanization standing at crosshairs with wetland preservation? It's the development versus climate change debate a pertinent issue?
So I would say urbanization versus wetlands is perhaps not a narrative. The new narrative should be uh, urbanization with wetlands. How can we can have urban development trajectories which can conserve wetlands? For example, in China, you have the model of sponge cities. So the cities are the new reality. Cities are, with India increasingly urbanizing. Our policy systems are geared towards more, economic activities around few parts of the land. Urbanization is a reality. What is important to consider is, rather than fighting against urbanization, we should look at opportunities wherein urban development does not kill wetlands. And the solutions are look into models like smart cities. Even in Delhi, you have models like Yamuna Biodiversity Park. So you can create spaces for conservation. East Calcutta city has, Calcutta city has East Calcutta wetlands. Guwahati has Deepor Beel. So it is not about urbanization at crosshairs. It is ensuring that urbanization does not end up eating the wetlands, number one, does not end up contaminating the wetlands, and has systems solutions which conserve wetlands rather than working against it.
Yes, sir. That is what we are aiming towards. That urban development should not kill the wetlands, but urban development is also needed. That can preserve the wetlands and the biodiversity.
The success of good urbanization is when your environmental footprint is minimized and your track record in sustaining your landscape is good. There are models. These are not, impossible or, for that matter, conflicting goals. You can have urbanization which is sensitive to nature, which respects nature, which can provide for nature, and vice versa.
Thank you, sir. This lecture was a very thought-provoking one, and I'm sure all the questions that we have gotten. I wish we had a little bit more time, but we are unfortunately running out of time. But we would like to have another discussion like this, sir, on talking about maybe the effect of on the role of private sector in conserving wetlands. What we talked about today is basically non-governmental organization, but private companies and all, which can be can be included in conserving the wetlands, could be also another lecture, sir. Thank you, sir, for joining us today, and thank you to all our guests who joined us today for this webinar and your questions. And we actually enjoyed answering the questions. And please write to us at events at asianconference.org if in case you want to put any more questions for this lecture. And thank you, Dr. Kumar, for giving us your time and making this wonderful presentation, and giving us an insight on the need to conserve and balance climate change effects and wetland conservation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Atri. It's a pleasure. Bye bye.